We do thank our
I'm here
God
with
for
Marty and with
2025. We thank you for this opportunity to gather together to learn what it means to listen to you. We pray for your wisdom for Ken, for the engagement with T.F. Torrance. So we pray that you would guide us into what it is that speaks to our time and our place. So we pray for wisdom and insight for words and concepts that seem vague, that you would bring them into clarity, that we might be servants of your word. So bless this day and all that we do and say. We pray in your name, you who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
So
Ed,
today, just for a brief introduction, we are
I got
continuing our
gasoline.
look at the nature of this particular part that we're in. We're still covering this survey of the history of theology and scientific development.
yeah,
And this is the fourth section of that, looking particularly at the place of the human subject in knowledge. So we've been surveying the nature of the object of what is studied. And so he's, in a sense, ending this particular part that Ken will lead us through on what is this human knowing? What is going on here that we can ask questions about the ultimate coming together of theology and science. So this covers pages 85 to 105. Ken doesn't have an outline, but he promised he would guide us well through the desert, the wilderness, over the mountain, and through the woods. To grandmother's house we go. There are three basic sections in here. The first one just dealing with the nature of the human. Then on page 92, he has an A where he talks about the nature of subjectivity. And then on page 99, there's a B in the side, and there he talks about our attitudes towards nature. So anyway, Ken, I'm going to pass it over to you to begin to guide us through what I consider a pretty wonderful and important section here.
yeah.
Recording in progress.
We got a feedback loop going now. Okay. The something I discovered late last night, probably later than I should have stayed up. I was amazed to find, this is sort of a sidebar to everything else. This is the first book Torrance wrote, a full-length philosophical, theological treatise. It's over 300 pages long. He was already 54 years old. He had been teaching for 20 years. He had never written anything that long before. And on the one hand, you go, interesting that it took that long, but the other was that the essay, it finally occurred to me, the essay was his favorite form of communicating. He liked to write short, tight, closely argued points, and then when it was done, stop. And if he needed to take it up again another time, he'd write another essay. And this is his first long, sustained argument that had to be suspended over many chapters in order to make his points. And it's that sort of shifted my lenses a bit to be able to realize that what he is doing and what he is not doing. And he actually invited me to that line of thinking because at the beginning of this chapter, theology and scientific development, he has a little footnote. He says, see Theology and Reconstruction, Chapter 4. Theology and Reconstruction, here, Chapter 4, is a lecture that he gave to Swiss pastors back in 1962. And it was entitled The Influence of Reformed Theology on the Development of Scientific Method. That was his topic. And when I compared the essay as he was wrote it and published it in 62, 63, in some places it's almost word for word what appears in this chapter. This is where it finally ended up being embedded between his what he had to say in chapter 2 and this is chapter 2, And what he would now be saying in chapter 3 on the nature of scientific activity, uh, uh, I went and I looked as he wrote this book. It made his reputation, and he did not write another book this long for another 2 decades when he finally did write the Trinitarian Faith. And then a decade after that, the Christian Doctrine of God, which was his masterpiece. So that kind of long, sustained thinking and exposition did not come to him easily. And I now appreciate why he said it took him almost 10 years to write the book, rewriting and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, because he kept uncovering and discovering things that he had taken for granted in earlier constructions, and realized he could not continue to do that. Was Bart one time said, I'd say the same thing, but I'd use different words. This Torrance had the same way of developing his thought. He would want to, broadly and generally wanted to say the same thing, but he had to use different words.
Can you think of an example of that, Ken?
In here, in the essay, he throws it's very compact and tight, and he uses Francis Bacon as you might expect, as an example of somebody, a scientific thinker who had religious affiliations. When he does the essay in a considerably longer thing, he drops Bacon from his earlier examples and uses instead Occam, William Occam, in order to show a medieval thinker who was using critical thought to criticize philosophy, and in the process also criticizing theology, but borrowing biblical concepts in order to do that. He diversifies his examples. He's obviously read more medieval theology and history of medieval theology since even 1962. And that ends up in the footnotes in this chapter. Also, in this, he has a whole section on Kierkegaard and dynamic thinking. He cuts that. It probably will show up later in theological science, but he does not bring that up as a fifth point. He just drops it. It's cut. And instead, he has this 3 or 4 pages on natural theology. How natural theology is going to be a natural outgrowth of the conversation between theology and science. So excuse me for a moment, I'm very dry. And since that's caffeinated coffee, very soon I'm going to be talking so fast I'll finish my sentences before I start. So to Marty's description, we have this letter A on page 92. What he is trying to he uses the first few pages to introduce the topic of the human subject. And in this section, it's almost word for word as he had it before. This is what he's been thinking about for a long, long time. That the human subject has to be part of our looking for the right word, epistemology, that there has to be a certain self-referential turn to our thinking. We cannot simply assume that we know what we're talking about when we're talking about how we know what we know. It needs that self-reference. And here, again, he starts from the theological side because this is an artifact from his article on how Reformed theology influenced scientific method. He points to Calvin as somebody who, from the very beginning, because it's a theological point, it's a biblical point, you must be critical of your own theology. You cannot arrogantly assume that you've received enough revelation, received enough truth, that even as you express your statements in words and write them out on a page, you must criticize them. There must be this self-critical turn. And in
One
theology,
thought there, Ken, I just want to make sure we establish this. A subject is a personal knower. It can be God, can be subject as one who knows us, or the human in science is a knower as well. So
yeah,
the human as knower is subject. Epistemology is the process of knowing. So I just want to have terms to clarify the
yeah,
dynamic. The critical piece of that is to always question the nature of your conclusions in knowing,
yeah,
to recognize you may go amiss.
yeah.
Okay.
It here he has not put the full-blown searching for the right words, questioning of the questions that I was expecting. I thought he would immediately have, as in the Christian doctrine of God, which is like 20 years in the future. He'll spend pages going on about how God is both subject and object, and that is the key to understanding revelation. That's not in here. It may show up when he starts talking about the nature of truth in all of its ramifications. And as I have not read the whole book yet, I don't know if that's going to end up there, or is it something that's really going to take him a while to get his head around. But here, he's simply pointing out the intellectual parallels between the humility and the modesty of a theologian like Calvin, who, as a matter of theology, as demonstrated principle, questions his questions because he knows that as a creature, he cannot express the glory of the Creator except in inadequate terms. And Tom points out this idea of accommodation, that it is a part of our rationality, that we rely upon that which is outside of us to accommodate itself to us and our limitations so that knowledge can take place. And he says that for Calvin was God's accommodation to us in the Holy Spirit. And he says in science, they began to, even the early scientists spoke with great humility about the ability of nature to reveal itself, as if it were a sentient being almost. But that was, I have to be careful with my language because medieval theology almost divinized nature in some places in a mystical way. Early science dispelled that, but it still had a reverence and a reliance on nature revealing itself to the inquirer, the object, even in being objective, revealed something of itself to we, the subjects, as we study it. And that's okay. That's part of our rationality, and it's part of the isness of everything. He does struggle to express that because it is almost paradoxical, but he says it's science has gotten much more candid about it, especially in the last 100 years. That trying, if you read early modern science, let's say the late 1800s or early 1900s, it's very plain that almost arrogantly there's the assumption that science is simply going to go from triumph to triumph to triumph, and until it objectivized everything. It is learned all there is to know. And then Torrance says, but Kant could have told them that's not possible. You cannot possibly know everything there is to know. It's too big. Your rationality cannot contain it. And so it is irrational to be that arrogantly rationalist. If you're going to genuinely be rational, you must have already ask yourself, what are the limits to my knowledge? And not to forever stay within those tiny limits, but to acknowledge that it's not all going to come in a great flood of information, and it's theoretically inexhaustible.
If there's a questioning of questions, it's the question of limits and focus. What are the proper focus and loci? And when do our limits actually stop us from seeing that there are things beyond our limitations that we could at least acknowledge are there, even if we don't pursue them? And that if you build walls, then you simply stop what would be appropriate knowledge.
Yeah. He sticks to physics in his examples here. And in later essays, he will begin to broach psychology and sociology. And the mature Torrance will have things to say about the limits which sociology adhere to and the limits that psychology must adhere to if it's to be a true science. And that will be exciting stuff, but it's not in this book.
Which book is that in?
I'm not The Christian Doctrine of God, for one,
Okay.
but in other essays and things. I'm sorry that in trying to get ready to read this, I finally got into Elmer Collier's How to Read T.F. Torrance.
Good.
And one of the advantages of Collier is that he groups things by topic and then says, and in his footnotes, he says, if you want to see where he does this, and he points you to where it occurs. The Ground and Grammar of Theology, for example, has some great stuff in it. But I was going so fast. At one point, I realized I was crediting Alistair McGrath with thoughts that Elmer Collier had said, and I was giving Collier credit for something that McGrath had said, and I had put a pin in it and say, hang on, I can't get everything I know about Tom Torrance into 1 hour today. I'm going to have to set up some limits. So one of the limits was let's look at what Tom is saying in 1969. And my first question was to ask, why did it take him so long to write this book? He is not usually somebody who is that reluctant to commit himself. And as I said, it was because one thing I will allege here is that the argument was so sustained and so long and so complicated that he couldn't get it into an essay. He had to write a book. And getting the pieces cut and shaped and placed into the foundation and then the upper layers and then the pinnacle of his arguments, he kept moving things around. He had to decide where to take this up, where to put it in, and that's something that he had not had to do before. And I think that's why it took him so long. So if as we're reading through this, if I see other examples of this later, I'll try to flag them and point them out. But it was unique that at least this chapter had a first draft that he published almost contemporary, just 4 or 5 years before. Gives you a chance to put them side by side. There's another example that occurred to me late last night. I bolted awake. We have been talking occasionally, some of us, about the mimeograph handouts that he gave out in his lectures at New College. There's another way to see his thought develop over time, because the mimeograph handout he would hand out in 1972 would get re-edited or rewritten by about 1975. And in some cases, I have stuff that he did in 1973, and I have the book that was edited from his handouts, Incarnation and Atonement. And and so I've got some handouts that got reproduced in that book with lots of other inserts. Where did those inserts come from? That was his later editing, later amplifications, his later development of his thought in Christology in particular. There's a doctoral dissertation there somewhere for somebody who wants to try to document how his thought developed in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, as he tries to work all these points out.
McGrath didn't do that in his work. You
no,
feel he no.
No. One thing he did do is he put the bibliography together, the complete chronological bibliography is always the first thing a scholar has to have. What are your sources? And just getting it all together in one place with dates, and taking care to note when translations were made, or when not abbreviations. What do you call it when you cut down a text to make it smaller to fit?
Abridged.
Abridged. Thank you. That's it. I have a copy of his book on the Book of Revelation. It's sermons. And it was published first in the United States by Erdman's in 12 chapters. Apparently, that's not all he wrote, because it says in McGrath's bio that the British edition has additional material that was abridged from the American. I don't know why Erdman's did that. It drives me nuts now, because I don't know what's not there in my copy. But that is what McGrath did do. It's now going to have, as I say, it's going to be somebody else who will spend time with the boxes and boxes of Torrance papers, going through each of these, say the mimeographs, if they have survived. Unfortunately, the paper is brittle. Yeah, I don't know how long it'll last. And watch how he changes his texts as he reads more, as he's criticized more, and as he realizes he needs to restate that. So this is taking a little too long, but I did want to say that these are the things that keep me up at night.
When you get a chance, Bryden has his hand up, but if you need to finish with that.
Right.
In the same vein, Ken, when we started this book, I referred to Alistair McGrath's 2016 fellowship address, where he begins by saying that he read the book 3 times, Theological Science, 3 times. And I think when you start to have that kind of a process as well going on, he reads it when he's young. He reads it for his intellectual biography, and he reads it as preparation for his address, having been invited by, whoever. And I think what's happening with your very long preface, which I'm thoroughly enjoying, because it's the kind of thing that I had to do myself with some of the work of Robert Jensen, A, for a doctorate, and B, for much later on. Anyway, that's parallel. That's all it is. It's parallel. And when you start doing this, what happens is that you crystallize your own thinking. So what we're getting is actually Ken Ross at 3 a.m. when you're waking up and going ping, ping, ping. And I love it, because the rest of us need to learn how to have that ping. The ha-ha moments, as a friend of mine used to call them, when stuff suddenly coalesces. And I would urge people after this session today to go back to that video of the 2016 address, because Alistair's talk there is different to his intellectual biography, which is certainly different to the undergraduate well, just recently graduated McGrath, who suddenly stumbles upon this stuff anyway in the first place. So bless you for what you're doing, because it's the ha-ha moments that actually, I think, are really the nuggets that we have to dig for. Enough.
Right, and
Thank you.
if you can post the link to that lecture either here or on the Facebook site so that people could follow that lecture up, that would be great.
I think it's, with respect, Marty, it's already in the thread. Uh, it's on your page, because I did it as we began this whole book exercise
Okay.
months ago. But I'll
Okay.
find it again, I'll refresh it, and I'll bring it front and center.
Yeah, no,
Thank
I
you.
love your thought, and I just want to make it as easy as possible for people
Oh,
to
yeah,
follow.
yeah. I mean, I agree. Let's treat everybody as morons, because we probably are.
Hmm.
Or challenged, maybe. I don't know if we're all the way to morons, but
Ah, come
we'll
on.
put
It's
moron later. And now back to you, Ken. Back to
Well,
you.
to try to sum up the first point Tom is making about science and the word infinity keeps intruding into my thought, and I have to push it back and hang on for a moment. That both science and religion, theology, I should use Tom's terms, science and theology have to exercise a due humility. And that humility is not a confession of inadequacy. It is simply a mark of caution. Otherwise, you can say if you can't know God in God's holiness, and there's no point in pursuing God at all. You just throw up your hands and say it can't be done, therefore I'm not even going to try. And no scientist can say that either. That just because you have figured out the periodic table and you've gotten 100 out of 103 elements correctly placed, and you can't get those last two into any place anywhere, do you throw the whole thing out? Or do you pursue it, try another means or another creative way of piecing these things together? I go back to the periodic table. It's a favorite illustration for me of the scientific method, as experiment and try and experiment and try. It's until finally somebody got it, and with it, the whole thing's opened. Tom's favorite example is James Clerk Maxwell and the field theory. That once he changed the paradigm from Newton's containers and boxes to fields, everything began to fall into place. That according
He also
to
loves light.
light.
He also loves light. Yes.
Yeah. From Einstein, it's almost that passage in one of his smaller books. It's almost poetry. It's a sermon on light. That even it's the elements of light which are unknowable to us, because we cannot exceed the speed of light, and we can quantify it. We can say it's 186,000 miles per second, but we can't go that fast. And there may be things that can go faster than that, but we can't know about them because the light that goes from them back to us can't reach us in time. So does that mean that we are doomed to be forever ignorant about the true facts of the universe because our eyes are too dim and our brains are too small? Or doesn't that just kind of act as an additional goad to say, but isn't it amazing what we can know? And can we quantify that and group it and expand it and glorify God that we are given this opportunity to use our minds in creative ways? That
That's the humility of knowledge, right?
Humility of knowledge. Yeah, and this is here earlier. Tom's would tended to be very critical of Kant. He seems to be more tolerant, appreciative of what he can learn from Kant, or he can point people who are more Kantian than Kant to say, no, go back and read the master. Kant knew this paradox. You haven't just recently discovered it. And he already had built it into his theory of knowledge, so that you can't say you defeated Kant and you can now move on to Hegel or something else. Poor person. But I was interested that the number of times he would footnote certain Kantian philosophers and historians of doctrine of science, that he does not think that he is out over his skis here. That he is not. This is not his radically new stuff. This is stuff that he is now quite confident he's got down cold, solid, and so he's carefully drafted this chapter. The humility that allows a theologian to be humble, and the humility that allows a scientist to be humble, is the same rational humility of any knowing knower. It is not a defeat for religion. It is not a defeat for science to come up to a limit and not transgress it. To recognize it as a real limit. That's rational.
So, Ken, I want to take you back to the first two sentences in the chapter, which is the contrast that sets the whole direction of the chapter. If you could just, kind of read those and say, what is he's standing at the beginning of a trail and saying, this is where we're going. So if you could just kind of characterize the nature of the contrast of where it is that he wants to take us here, that would be great.
Yeah. Page 85, he says, it's a truism that knowledge of an object is knowledge by a subject, for the subject has always had a logical place in knowledge. First sentence. To press on just a little more, he says, as we have seen, however, the great change that came over theology at the Reformation involved giving humanity in his life and knowledge a full place as a human subject over against God, who was thought of as addressing the human personally through God's word and summoning us to active obedience. I thought that's a darn good summary of the Reformation for his purposes. It's always struck me as rather odd that historians of the church, if you want to take all 2,000 years of the church's history, you do need to come to these pivot points. And you have to be able to describe what was before, and you have to describe what came after, and you have to describe something of the character of the pivot. I've been working on the Reformation as a pivot point for like 30 years or more, mostly because when I was learning church history to start with, Ernst Troeltsch and Max Weber were arguing that there wasn't any Reformation. It actually didn't happen. That was a categorical error. No, I'm pretty sure something happened, and I've got several shelves of books now to show something happened, and that needs to be taken seriously. Here, Tom is saying, well, for his purposes of looking at the relationships between science and theology, are you giving the human subject, the knower, full place in your theory of knowledge, is where we started.
Which is
Uh,
Michael Bliney's move. All knowledge is personal knowledge.
yeah, I did check. He's not really into Bologna yet.
He does get mentioned in this chapter, but only
Yeah,
once.
yeah. It's we compared to other places where some places he'll say, sort of step back and let Bologna take the stage. It's he's discovered him, but I'm not sure he's finished assimilating him. We're looking at the index here. Bologna.
So the
Yeah.
purpose of the argument here, though, is to say
Mm,
there is no knowledge that we would call knowledge that isn't the knowledge of humans. So if you think you have, quote unquote, an objective knowledge without a human element to it, that
mm,
is some other knowledge that is probably just made up in your mind, some idealistic thing, but even the idealist thing is a human knowledge. So if we can
yeah.
just get used to it, we're all humans,
Mm,
we're all thinking. The Reformation said we are thinkers before God who wants to be known. In a
mhm.
sense, that's the big breakthrough is the acknowledgement of the givenness of God to be known by the human. And so to say, by grace, God giving God self, the human knows, call that faith. And that is what a scientist exercises when they stand before the objects of their knowledge as well.
Yeah. And does it go without saying that some knowers know better than others, that some theories of knowledge are better than other theories of knowledge, that there are some, we can exercise critical judgment and say, Polonier said it best, or Martin Buber said it better, or Kierkegaard caught the nuance that's missing here, that we can exercise that kind of critical judgment. Because these are before Tom discovered Polonier, he was using Buber. I was holding up Collier's book because when Collier deals with Torrance on faith and nature, he says his roots, his first stuff is very much Martin Buber. He has not yet found Polonier, and he doesn't quite realize what he's gotten a hold of. But when finally he does read Polonier, Ian Torrance once, I overheard him one time say, his father was rushing past him in the hallway and threw a copy of Polonier at him, personal knowledge. Says, "Here, it's fabulous. Read that book," and chased off down the hall. That the joy of that discovery, I expected to explode, and it was probably another reason why it took him 7 or 8 years to finish this book. When he started it, he had not yet read Polonier, and when he finished it, he was in the process of assimilating this knowledge and really beginning to see where it could take him, and how it tightened up his arguments all over the place. Well, that was.
But he's read McMurray, and McMurray made some of those points as well. So Brighton's got his hand up again. Brighton, what you got?
Just jump in, Brighton. Just jump in.
Oh no, mate. No, mate. No. We have a compare and an MC. It's cool. I think dates are again important. Using your own historical stuff. Buber is pre-Second World War. Okay. And Gabriel Marcel is pre-Second World War. And I bring him in because he has this wonderful distinction between puzzles and mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's actually, yeah, so I mean, it's groping at the same thing. Whereas Polanyi only turns himself into a philosopher of science post Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And his first book, his first attempt at that is Science, Faith, and Society, which I still think is where you start reading Polanyi. You can't get tacit dimension and personal knowledge until you've read Science, Faith, and Society. Because again, Polanyi's on a pilgrimage. Hey guys, we're all on a pilgrimage. And these epochal moments that you keep talking about, I stupidly call ha-ha moments myself. Collectively, we have ha-ha moments. We can call one of them the Reformation and blah blah blah, and Maxwell and I agree. That's a ha-ha moment if ever there was one. Shifting from Newtonian to field theory. Now we're into something called, well, I don't know what it's called. Quantum theory? I mean, heaven knows what it is. String, exactly. String theory. I mean, yikes. I mean, my maths ain't up to that anymore. Give up.
No.
I
My
mean,
cat took the string, and I'm
yeah. I
stuck.
mean, I have a friend who's 3 years old, 2 or 3 years older than I am, who did his PhD in maths after Oxford University and blah blah blah. He's won a few awards now for the history and philosophy of mathematics. I mean, he is off the charts. And I mean, we need people like that. He's a beautiful Christian soul, beautiful Christian soul. But the point is that Polanyi himself, with the greatest of respect, I put it in the chat notes. By the time we come to 1985 and reality and scientific theology, he's actually gone beyond Polanyi. I really believe TF went beyond Polanyi by 1985 in the publication of that book. And Ground and Grammar, I think, was 82 or 81 or something. So again, earlier. So these dates that McGrath is putting down and the dates that you're alluding to and our own little dates, well, heaven knows what 2025 is going to unfold. I mean, I'm already in the 3rd of January and you guys are catching up on the 2nd. I mean, come on, guys, get on with it. Enough.
So
Polanyi, even in his closing statement of personal knowledge, makes it obvious that he has not really got the objectivity of God as personal. It's still collapsed into the subject, human, at some level. And the points that he's making in this very section, I think that Polanyi at the end of personal knowledge had not yet grasped.
No, there. Yes. My copy of personal knowledge is starting to yellow around the edges. I've had it for so long, and I haven't read it yet. I'm hoping my eyesight lasts long enough that I can do that, and still have time to go read The City of God in English translation, just because.
Please read the new 21st century New City Press version. The translation is sensational.
Okay, thank you. That's been one of my pet peeves for a long time. I want to read Aquinas, but I want to read Augustine, but slogging through some of these translations. I mean, the modern library edition of The City of God was translated in the 1650s. It's horrible. Right, now, so to go part 2, letter B, having carefully laid out that Niels Bohr, Kant, here's Polanyi already listed, but von Weizsäcker, other historians of Kantian philosophy and historians of scientific thought were making these points. As I say, Tom in this chapter does not think he is broaching any astonishing new theory or claiming something that is going to have everybody throw up their hands and say, "Well, that's just you. No, you're a crack brain." He think, as always, it's like back when he was giving his quick organizing my thoughts, a history of science and the shift from the medieval perspective to the early modern perspective. His footnotes are crammed with standard histories of science. I have them over on my shelf. I've had them for years. When I see them there, it's rather comforting to see an old familiar name and an old familiar voice. And it's exactly those points where I don't look to see if Tom has claimed something that he simply cannot sustain academically, and somebody else is going to write a book saying, "No, you're wrong. You did not get gross testa correct." and that's not Occam. Sorry. B, you had the page for the letter B.
I want to take you back just a little bit. The top of 89, these, fabulous statements. All important here is the famous notion that the thing in itself, upon which, as Kant saw it, the whole notion of science depends. Yeah, I mean, that's just a big, it's like, okay, you're climbing a cliff. There's something he wants you to recognize. This is important for getting the whole. Can you talk a little bit about what it is that Torrance is bringing, using such a staccato language to try and help us to see something of importance?
No, here is illustrating that even Kant knew that a science that aspires to know the thing in itself has already set itself a task it cannot achieve. So there's a certain amount of euphoria that swept Europe in the Enlightenment, that the Dark Ages are ended, that the age of light has begun, that humanity is going to go from barbarism to civilization, from ignorance to knowledge, and from poverty into prosperity. This it was going to come because we finally had found a method that allowed us to dominate nature. And with that, we could coop nature up and cross-examine it to disgorge all of its secrets, and we would be like gods. That even Kant said is simply not possible. But it try to persuade college freshmen with a first introduction to philosophy, when they sit there going, well, if you can't know everything, what's the point in learning anything? Kant had already said there's a certain amount of let me see if I can find it.
So the nature of thingness here, I guess, is part of the question.
Yeah, science cannot operate when nothing is given. We cannot produce knowledge out of nothing, and cannot conduct any experiments apart from certain determinate conditions on the side of the object, making it capable of being acted on. On the other hand, science does not arise where the object is completely transparent and directly and immediately knowable. Is it there or is it not there? We can't tell. That science as a method only works in constricted places. And we're 200 years into this experiment, and it keeps evolving, but we've all learned to be a little more humble about it. I'm sorry, several thoughts are all going through my head at the same time, and I need to.
I thought I could see them there.
Yeah, the Ding an sich. Because Tom used to talk about it. He would essentially to say that no more than a theologian says you cannot possibly know God in God's entirety because God is infinite and absolute, and you are not. Therefore, there's no true knowledge of God possible. It's stated a falsehood. That is not true. And Tom says, and the Reformation already knew that. Just because we do not have the capacities of Aquinas to reveal all sides and dimensions of God, we do have Calvin, and we do have the Bible, and there's certain propositions that can be made. They are not categorically infallible or inerrant, but they're darn good propositions, and we can work with them. This is how God accommodates God's self to us in Jesus Christ. It's not a matter of all or nothing. It's a life of covenant and inquiry that is enormously rewarding, and it's rewarding in science and it's rewarding in theology. And neither are being irrational in a acknowledging those limitations and staying within them. In fact, they are being exquisitely rational to stay within those limits because it's very productive when you do. And that's not a question of pragmatism, it's a question of devotion. Now, that second point you wanted to make, there was A on page 92.
But I'm not quite done with that page yet. Just a little bit further down, he makes this contrast between what we can agree with in Kant and what we can't.
Right.
No pun intended.
Can't with Kant. No.
Kant, yeah, we can't agree with him. So that insofar then as Kant claimed that scientific knowledge must be
right,
evaluated in accordance with the prior structure of our consciousness. And I guess my question here was particularly, I was taught about the transcendental unity of apperception means that Kant saw the brain, in a sense, trying to fit everything that's experienced within its thoughts. And therefore, like Descartes, the thinking transcendental being is projecting onto it. But he's agreeing with Kant at this point that there's this prior structure of consciousness, which sounds like the transcendental unity of apperception, but he's agreeing. So it's like, Tom, what are you doing here? I'm just a little bit confused.
Yeah,
Can you clarify that for me?
Kant himself it raises up as a basic philosophical principle that you need to pay attention to how we know what we know in order to be confident in what we know. That's part of philosophy, and he does a pretty darn good job of it. The problem was I'm hesitating because I'm trying to remember things that I read about Barth and Kant. Barth was another. When he got to university, he says the first thing he did is he just devoured Kant from all of the major critiques. He read them all. But eventually he was alienated and distanced himself from the neo-Kantians of the faculty where he was a student. And his brother, Heinrich Barth, who was a philosopher and specialized in Kant, distinctly made a distinction between what Kant claimed and where Kant stopped in his developments, saying, I can't go any further than here. And the neo-Kantians who turned transcendentalism almost into a lay religion, the ability of the consciousness to include everything. And I even last night on my feed, I'm getting a science proves that your consciousness is in touch with the entire universe. And I'm looking at that and I'm going, that's clickbait, I know, because the proposition all by itself is ridiculous. But somebody is out there making money selling courses on getting in your consciousness in touch with things. Sorry, Marty, I got a little bit off track there. The main point Torrance wants to make here is that there is a form of Kantianism that says unless your brain can get all the way around it, you cannot know it. And without that, it's the job of our consciousness is to impose order on nature.
So it's not quite katafusen, but it is a recognition
yeah.
that says there is something there. So he's wanting to say Kant saw that there was something there, that we can perceive the ability to see the orderliness of it. That's his point of agreement.
It's a point of agreement, and it's not so much with Kant as the neo-Kantians that he's disagreeing with, because it came almost an arrogance that if I can't know, it's not worth knowing. Or the whole of my experience can be sorted into the things I can know and the things I can't know, and I'm not going to waste any more time on the things I can't know. The other piece of the arrogance was there is a whole school of thought that there is no order in nature in and of itself. There's only order in our minds. we impose the order in our minds on nature in order to manipulate it, in order to make it more knowable and accessible to us. Now, for most scientists, I think, this is no, you have to sit quietly and let nature open itself up to you, revealing the order that's intrinsic to it. You cannot put it on the rack and torture it into revealing order, or get it to yield and say, I confess, you're right, that's the order that's here. It says that's not scientific method, and it brings the real course of scientific inquiry to a dead stop. It cannot go that way. I'm pursuing that epistemological point because this is where Polanyi watched with horror some of his colleagues who were chemists and biologists in the Soviet Union be put on trial because they refused to accept the socialist psychology and the socialist sociology that was being imposed by the Stalinist regime. That essentially you can believe it if you want to, and we will make you want to. That proposition so it's the end of freedom, the end of coercion, and you'll not learn any more biology, you'll not learn any more sociology, you'll not learn anything psychology now, because you have killed the whole open-ended structure of genuine scientific inquiry, and instead posed this closed imposition of a pseudoscience instead.
Which is what bad theology does.
Yes, and in bad theology, it's the same thing. It's why it's not in this book, but Polanyi does write a book on open societies. The genuinely reflective scientist has to believe in intellectual freedom. Must. She cannot work with anything less, and the society can't work with anything less. It becomes a dictatorship and it collapses of its own weight. That's nowhere near where Tom needs to go here, but he does have a couple of books on grace and law, which are turning yellow on my shelves right now. I want to get to
them. A lot of yellow shelf going on. So he uses the word violently in the next paragraph. Whenever Thomas uses the word violently, Tom Torrance getting violent means pay attention, right?
Yes.
Where we must disagree violently with Kant, however, is in his attempt to convert the fact that nature only yields her secrets to us when we constrain her to act within the limits we impose, and according to specifications we bring to her in our coercive questioning, in a general principle in which the conformity of the object to the mind of the knowing subject is attributed to our power of knowing, or is predicated of our human nature. Can you say that in one short sentence?
No.
Well, it's something about we can't force nature into our boxes. Is that kind of what he's saying?
Yeah, and when we acknowledge that the boxes are ours and that they are not somehow they were out there and I just happened to pick it up, I constructed it. I needed a nature that would do this. That is the definition of magical thinking. Is it's not genuinely scientific.
I wondered if it's the distinction that we might make between systematic theology and dogmatic theology as proposed by Torrance and Barth. Dogmatic theology is heuristic, discovering kind of theology, whereas many systematic theologies take a system, maybe based in Aquinas, some form of logic, and then attempts to read doctrines and so forth into the boxes, and that if the complaint that Torrance has right here isn't maybe that complaint.
He was already disturbed by process theology. That Whitehead and his theory of relativity was attempting to integrate a transcendentalism into a theory of relativity without God. It just left him, Tom, annoyed. He says that if there was ever a case of creating a box and then attempting to get everything into it by systematic reflection,
Or we
that
could use
was
the
an
word
example.
fundamentalist there. The fundamentalist right also had its boxes
Oh yeah,
that would be a similar kind of thing to the right, whereas the process theology would be more towards the left.
yeah. It's process theology. God is immanent within creation. Fundamentalism would there'd be it presupposes a radical break between creation and God, and God is divine and holy and eternal, and creation is profane, unholy, and limited. And propositions are communicated by God to creation through infallible and inerrant sources. If you're Protestant, the Bible. And then the question of which Bible, which translation of which Bible, and all of that. But it keeps regressing backwards. The fundamental error was the radical dualism between God and the earth. It does not allow for the incarnation at all, or that God speaks words in Jesus, that Jesus is the Word.
So let's bring Bryden back in. Bryden,
Oh, he's
what
got
you got?
Yeah. I want to have a crack at your attempt at compressing that wonderful series of words.
Beautiful.
I would simply say categories and paradigms are open-ended and therefore malleable and heuristic. And that seems to be how science itself is elastic and yet also firm,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's a remarkable juxtaposition of what I've just called the elastic and the firm.
Yeah.
Mm.
And when we begin to see that that's actually how we all think,
Yeah,
because we have to have firmness, otherwise, just go home and stop this right now, Marty.
right.
But we also have to have elasticity, which is the fun and the joy of meeting once a week and giving it a crack.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's a very, very simple example of what we all do the whole time, whether it's the pub or the Christmas tree or whatever else it is. And a good sermon will also engage in not too dissimilar a way.
And the
You know,
opposite
it,
of elastic and firm in your illustration would be
oh, me,
yeah,
definitely
you.
me.
It was your
Yeah,
illustration
definitely
now.
me.
Definitely you. What's the opposite? Is it's rigid and something?
No, it's closed. It's the stuff you were talking about earlier, Ken,
Yeah.
which prompted my own thing in the chat. The politicization of science in whatever form, Stalinist, contemporary stuff, the financing of research, all that business comes into the controlling of science. And I think we need to be terribly awake to that.
Yeah.
It is remarkable how, in the last 20 plus years or so, it's so difficult to get research validated in certain areas. And I mean, you get John le Carre and the Constant Gardener giving it a crack. And then the film comes along and gives it a crack. And I mean, these are popular cultural examples of saying, hey, wake up, guys. Something's
Mm.
afoot here. Anyway, there we go. Enough.
Yeah.
Mm.
I wanted to bring in Matt Boswick's comment. I'm enjoying the discussion. Kant is fairly important in Schleiermacher's work. This
Mhm.
is an interesting discussion in how Torrance mentions him. Just wondering how seriously is Kant being taken in the 2020s, or has theology adopted other concerns interlocutors? Ken, do you want to speak to that?
Uh, there's still plenty of stuff being published on Kant. Well, there's still plenty of stuff being published on Plato. There will always be a market for uh, a good book on Plato. Uh, and Homer gets translated about once every 20 years. Who knew? The thing about Kant, I think it's Collier comments. He says, Tom is very careful not to use the word category because Kant, that is how Kant's thinking got bogged down and ossified by Kantians. He was using categories almost in a Hoyeristic sense, as Bryden was saying, that he would, while working on a theory about something, group some stuff together and call that a category of the stuff, and then group some other stuff very flexibly and pliably. And then eventually, if you need to change or modify, you do that. It's just a very practical way to work. But Kantian philosophers tended to insist that to be a true Kantian, you must work with Kant's categories, and they are very limiting. And then they have big fights over whether or not there is such a thing as a religious a priori. All these a priori that were more or less agreed on in the 1800s aren't holding up very well. And other people begin to argue about this and that and this and that. I was seeing that Schleiermacher showed up in the chat. Was that Bostwick? Yeah, Matt. That's I pause because I have to be very careful. I have read Schleiermacher's The Christian Faith, but that was 50 years ago, and it's like trying to recall the taste of ginger ale after 50 years. It's just I know I had it, but that's it. But in all the stuff about Schleiermacher that Mark Klein Taylor had us also read, they would talk about Kant and his the attempt to see if there was such a thing as a religious a priori. Was there something in the brain before we begin our religious inquiries that give us the basic tools we need to understand what religion is and how it works? I actually have a book by a reputable sociologist that is let me just read you the title. It's a little alarming. Here we go. Christian Smith, what a name to have. Religion, what it is, how it works, and why it matters. It was just published a couple of years ago. I bought it because I know somebody who is a graduate student of his. But can you? I would think from a devout point of view, isn't there a certain amount of profanity here? It's a sociologist attempting to defend religion on sociological grounds. I don't think sociology survives the effort. I'm not sure religion survives the effort, but it's out there.
It's a different kind of science that's hard to get a sense of what is the object of study, and doesn't it just collapse into human categories and experience?
Yeah, there's your word category again. Yeah, is there a religious a priori? Is the question. There are whole departments of religion that will argue about that, and they will say, yeah, there is, but you don't have it yet, or you have not yet formulated it correctly. Mine's better. A lot of them teach in Boston. I don't know why, but the whole.
I think they had a tea party there or something. They're a bunch of rebels.
Oh, it was Ralph Waldo Emerson, for
Ah,
crying out loud. I mean, there
uh-huh,
another book on my shelf here says that there were only two great American theologians. One of them was Jonathan Edwards. The other was Ralph Waldo Emerson,
uh,
and they shall never meet.
uh-huh.
These are the two schools of American theology, one of them based on revelation, one based on self-inspection, uh, which gets us back to the topic of our chapter here,
There's
the
a question
self-awareness.
from Ken McCurry. Did Barth leave behind neo-Kantianism? So again, this trajectory of what we're trying to establish with what can we go with and what can we not. Did Barth, he's asking, did Barth really leave neo-Kantian thought?
No, Heinrich Barth did not believe neo-Kantian thought, and if Heinrich and Karl never got along or agreed on anything, but if they both agreed that the neo-Kantians of Marburg, I got to make sure I got the right university, where Barth went to university, that they were just they were not reading Kant correctly. And did Barth leave Kant behind? Answer is yes. The a very a quick referral will be to the handbook on Karl Barth. Just the sections in there, and people like, excuse me for a second, George Hunsinger, Bruce McCormick, almost anybody that's done work in Barth since the 1990s. This is pretty well considered a settled issue. You don't. The only people who see Barth or Torrance being Kantian are people who don't like them and want to just prove that they're wrong by
And that would
accusing.
be because Kant is an idealist. Is that too short? Kant's
Uh,
world is one that lives in the world of reason, and that makes someone an idealist, and that doesn't allow us the rigor of what an appropriate scientific, which Barth and Torrance both wanted to
yeah,
engage the work of
yeah,
theology.
yeah. That the neo-Kantian turn was to take the philosophical construction of the religious a priori and say that is the cause of our religion. And now that we know it, we can tinker with it. We can get better religious out of our religious a priori. We can get better theologies that are more life affirming, more well, yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That is what was routinely said about Barth by people like Cornelius Van Til, the old Westminster theologians. They regarded if anything having Kant in it was modernism, and anything that was modernist was infidelity in disguise. They did not. They would find Kant under every box lid in the closet, just because once they proved he was a Kantian, they had proved he was a modernist, and they proved they did not need to study him or appreciate anything he said, and out the door he went.
So
No
one of
talk.
the phrases on this page to clarify, the very bottom line, it was discounted or denied the notion of the quote, the active reason developed with a vengeance. Can you just clarify what he means by that phrase? Because he's going to use it as we go through, and I think it'd be
No,
good to understand.
he back in his section on where's that title? Oh, the distinction between grace and nature, earlier in this, and then the Roman early modern philosophy recovered a sense of active reason. They made the medievals had distinguished between passive reason and active reason. And passive reason, you simply accept what reason tells you or what you apprehend in the world. You can't modify it. You can't change it. But active reason can take what it apprehends in the world and modify it and changes it by experimentation and development. That is, Thomas Aquinas would agree with that. It was pretty much a generally accepted, it's not an anthropology, but a philosophical assumption about how the human mind can work. And Thomas's own theology essentially was efforts to separate those things which passive reason must accept and what active reason can work upon. His whole question and answer method was to say, well, the church says this. Is that a given dogmatic truth we must accept, or can we understand it in other ways? And he said, well, and then you go on and question and answer, question and answer, question and answer. That is active reason. What Tom makes the point here is in the 1800s, the passive reason goes quiet. It does not talk much, whereas active reason, which was discovering things all over the place, got all the credit. It was one of his points here about Kant in particular, and a lot of philosophers in general, and most scientists, is passive reason needs to be taken seriously, because there are certain things like the speed of light beyond which you cannot go. You simply have to acknowledge it. There are infinity, can't get past it. The square root of -1 is an impossible number. Stop asking about it. Are you saying, Brian, you love it, or there's a great
it has a use. That's the funny thing.
Yeah.
Mathematicians create it.
Mm-hmm.
Decades later, engineers go, oh, this is actually something that can be made to put use, to good use. So, I mean, so the square root of -1 doesn't exist, but it does exist.
Yeah.
And I mean, and this is the point about mathematics and my thing and my post right at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Mathematics was waiting for a mathematician to arrive. And of course, mathematicians themselves are on a pilgrimage,
Mm-hmm.
because until they came across zero, things were a bit difficult. Then they came across blah, 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 blah. And finally, they've come across God knows what else. I mean, I'm not the mathematician. I've already fessed up to that. But my J in my language, minus the square root of -1 is fabulous. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, seriously, I do. I love it.
If you break down,
Go for it. Sorry,
Yael
there's
has
somebody else.
something you want to contribute there. Go ahead, Yael.
Yes, regarding the square root of -1, there is a number system called Clifford algebra or geometric algebra, where you can, if you think of numbers in multidimensional, then you think of a plane, x and y, 1 minus 1, and then the y-axis. You think of rotation, then square root of -1 happens to be a 90-degree rotation, because then if you square it, you get -1.
Yeah.
And that becomes a beautiful generalization of numbers. So square root of -1 traditionally is mysterious, but geometrically, in the context of geometric algebra or Clifford algebra, is just a rotation. And that can be generalized into multidimensions as well. So just a quick note.
Thank you.
If you put it in 3 dimensions, it creates a spiral.
It's
a corkscrew that keeps going.
Well,
which ought not to, if it were a truly impossible number, it simply would not. None of this would be true. From Einstein's perspective, mathematics should be tied to nature, because it is the tool we use to understand nature, and but it's only a tool, and sometimes garbage in, garbage out. we need to test that and constantly be testing it. But thank you for bringing that up, because I think we saw the same TED talk. I'm sitting there 3 o'clock in the morning. Oh, the square root of -1. Let's see what we can do with it.
So there
The
are
fact
two.
that active reason
think-
was able
I
to
think-
play with it.
I think as well, Tom makes a lot of point when he says that geometry itself has to go beyond a Euclidean frame. And the moment you get an Einsteinian frame, geometry then becomes something, dare I use the word, plastic, because space time is itself caught up into the whole business of agency. And I mean, if something is traveling fast, space time gets warped in inverted commas. So it's an extraordinary business now. You brought up geometry, my friend. Let's bring it up, but perhaps not today in this particular chapter or subsection of the chapter. But I mean, there we go. Enough.
Yeah.
So
Tom, by this time, has read enough Einstein that he is familiar with the debates within physics about number. And we did read that book on axiomatics and dogmatics. Was it Cairns? I'm pointing over there because that's where it's shelved in my library. People were studying with Torrance and writing books like that when this book was published. So he was very much brought into that conversation, but he does have a little footnote on page 94. But at the point where he wants to, what is the index number? Number, he says, or at least something corresponding to it, is embedded, as it were, in nature. And therefore, not only is nature amendable to rational inquiry, but the mathematical formulations that arise out of it can only be in a form which expresses at once the nature of the object and the mode of its cognition. Boy, that's a jawbreaker. And then there's a footnote. It says, I'm not arguing that everything is basically mathematical. He cites a James Jeans, that number is embedded in nature because it's created by a pure mathematician. It's almost Pythagorean. That it violates his sense of contingency to have that close a relation between order, number, and nature. Tom wants some more distance there. But he knows that people are talking that way, so it ends up as a footnote in this book. I don't know if he'll ever come back to it again. And I just want to get on to that, to what he wants to say about letter B on page 99. Because
let me just make one comment before I jump there. On page 91, the whole move to the anthropocentric outlook ultimately moved to what he called a mechanistic worldview and knowledge, and number and all that became part of that the nature of the knowledge of the world was measurability, all those things that he felt missed the point. And Einstein created a world that was open, dynamic, relational, instead of this substantial cause-effect, rigid Newtonian world. So there's a transition here in the culmination of point A that he's making on the nature of the subject collapsing into what looks like objectivity, but it ultimately is just human subjectivity, because everything's been defined by humans with their numbers as machine. And we've lost the whole dimension of really the nature of the personal in that point. So it's a slippery move. It's a sleight of hand move that makes it look like everything's objective. But the one holding the objective is those who hold the world so they can control it, measure it, and not actually treat it katafusan according to the nature of what it is.
And that he uses the term anthropomorphic. Because it was Barth who scorchingly indicted a whole school of theology because it kept converting language about God into language about people, and that saying essentially with Feuerbach that God really is only anthropomorphic, and that's its meaning. Religion can have meaning as long as it serves the needs of the human being. and points to its all the good things it can do, and that turns into narcissism. He does not put that in this section, but I think in an earlier, the knowledge of God section, he warns rather firmly about getting a healthy sense of the human being part of the knowing is good. It creates the kind of critical distance you need. But if anthropomorphism turns into mere anthropology, you're ending up here with this kind of theology based on sociology and psychology, not biblical revelation. And most important, you cannot explain evil. They over and over again, when I laying down after one of our great conversations, we've chased this thing around the block twice, but evil is the absurd in being discovered, embedded in the very fabric of life. And this kind of anthropomorphic science categorically leaves that out. There's not a way to build that in because it's absurd. I have not read Kant on evil. I'm told he's one of the few philosophers who treats evil seriously. But it is one thing that especially in this section when Calvin is being invoked so frequently, how could we possibly talk about things that theology can say to science and not bring up evil? That a science that has no boundaries and no limits and has no moral conscience, for lack of a better word, is a dangerous thing. And the fact that we know that, we can make arguments to scientists about that, and we have been doing that now since the invention of the atomic bomb. Every time we pick up on a new scientific discovery, there's always a sidebar on what could go wrong, because we have been burned so many times.
Like AI?
Yeah. What can go wrong?
What could go wrong? What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? That AI becomes as narcissistic as we are.
That is a
and it never sleeps, and it never eats, and it never rests.
Yes.
That could go wrong.
So just jumping over to page 95, the point he makes at the bottom. The point he makes at the bottom is that in the end here, the relationship between nature and the world became that we only study things exposed to our methods of questioning.
Yeah.
And therein you have a domination that creates the problematic relationship that he's going to have to deal with in this final section that begins with B.
Yeah.
How do we begin? What is the nature, as he uses the word, what is our attitude towards nature? And so if it's I get to select what I study and how I study it, you call that a stand of trees, I call it lumber. Right? It's like, but if we don't keep that, then the owls they won't have a habitat on these other creatures. Well, we need to have that as a resource for the human. I remember J.B. Torrance coming to Washington State and saying, I was shocked to see the signs entering the lands that are called natural resources to say land of many uses. He said, can't they see that all they're doing is reducing everything to a human use? And I think it's the point here of how do we have an attitude towards nature that is trying to be built by Torrance here.
Yeah, and it's not a genuine humanism. It's an anthropomorphism, which is almost pathological. But the world's wealthiest man, besides leaving his sperm all over creation, wants to go to Mars. It is human destiny to go to Mars. It is human destiny to populate the entire solar system and beyond.
To infinity and beyond.
To infinity and beyond. Yes. So even science can question that, but theology has to. But so with that, putting a pin on that line of thinking, because here he is, the title of the chapter is Theology and Scientific Development. He's saying what has happened in the 20th century where theology and science are talking to one another in areas that they had not spoken previously, because theology had pretended science had nothing to teach it, and science had pretended theology had nothing to say. Now we are in conversation, and in this last one, a critical revision of our attitude towards nature. He does talk about Spinoza and a few others, but he's already gone into that in a previous chapter on the knowledge of God. So we're just letting that one go. What we can learn from nature, what is natural, these kinds of things.
And what is naturalism becomes an important point on this page as well. On page 99, where that begins. And he says naturalism and idealism are, in a sense, two sides of a coin.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thought, because naturalism, that's, the person who just loves nature, and idealism is somebody with high ideals, philosophical and all that. And it's like, but his point seems to be that they are both two sides of a coin in human reason.
Yeah. I think it's in a footnote in here that he says that most romanticism eventually fizzles out. It's natural theology. When he's talking about natural theology, most natural theologies grow in a soil that is cultivated by religion, by theology, biblical religion. And apart from that, it eventually just fizzles out into a cheap transcendentalism. That's the kind of little philosophical ding that Tom is fond of throwing into a text on his way to make some other point. The
point there on 99 that ultimately nature became God created the problem for natural theology. And if you were going to have God, it had to be a God who was known looking through the lens of nature to discover what would be there, because reason demanded the human be able to get to God through his own capabilities and therefore through nature. Though for most, it's just, we don't need God anymore. He's an unnecessary presupposition. But the attempt to do theology using nature leads into this problem, which of course for both Barth and Torrance becomes significant in the relationship between theology and scientific development.
Yes, and he makes the point philosophically here. This is essentially that you cannot prove the existence of God scientifically. The methodology just doesn't allow for it, and any God you would discover is not going to be God. It's going to be something else.
Well, it depends on what you mean by scientific, also.
Yeah. When he says that science begins with what we already know and apprehend and proceeds outwards and wider, is the opposite of theology, which begins with what we don't know about God and proceeds to more knowledge and more knowledge and more knowledge. It says they're heading in opposite directions. So a theology trying to mimic the methods of science are not going to be successful, and theology that attempts to do that through what he's here calling natural theology is doomed to failure. The same as working with an awkward notion of infinity, working with a no concept of evil. I go back to that again. That if you start with the problem of evil, you've already left most science behind.
Well, the word prove that you used, I think is the critical word, because prove means I am now making the human the judge. Right. So I need to prove to you so that you can judge because you have the evidence, because you are worthy of being the judge as to whether this God exists, which I think he uses the term
Mm.
experimental science with that. And
Mm.
if my human experience can't prove God by somehow giving my experience the ability to make that judgment, then God must not exist. And so it's
Mm.
profound human judgment as the starting point. Whereas I think he didn't use the counter word, but I thought heuristic science or discovering science or something like that, that would be to say that with Polanyi, science is a community or a society of explorers,
Mm.
right? So, and their job is simply to keep exploring the nature of what is there, including God. And so to say, the God who gives God's self in the person of Jesus Christ, where there's a community that over the centuries and millennium even has been a faithful witness as a scientific society of explorers. We take what has been given to us and continue to explore and understand the nature of what is. That it is a form of science that is not the mechanistic, experimental, the humanistic judge proven, but the nature of proving ultimately becomes, in a sense, the problem. It is the ultimate kind of arrogance of the human calling science something when it's actually just a grasp for authority,
Mm.
right? And so confessing Jesus as Lord is going to be a claim that is made by the community of the church over the millennium. And that when we understand who he is, then we can do, I think Torrance says here, we can do a scientific understanding of the world. We just have a beginning point that begins in the givenness of God and the world and the nature of field thought. I mean, this is where Maxwell and Einstein,
Mm.
there's a givenness that's there that you don't just perceive the field of electromagnetic things going on, and yet it is there. And we discover it because we are heuristically engaged in this process of discovery, which is, I think, as you pointed out, open and dynamic,
Mhm.
and we can keep learning. And so, as he is, as he's moving to end this chapter, it's like we don't get rid of the human. We just need that proper humility and the ability to explore without having to be the authorities, in a sense, a final authority. I think it's appropriate to say when that doctor goes to cut into your whatever he's going to cut into, you want he or she to have skill to be authoritative in that particular field. And that all of it at some level is this attuning to reality, where people are granted a servant kind of authority within the natural world to study and work with others, but a final proving, a final authority. I think he wants to say if we don't leave that with God, then everybody becomes a kind of authority, and you end up with a world where everyone does what is right in their own eyes, becomes their own proof judges, and you get something like what we have in the world today. People have even lost their faith in science.
In the last pages where he cites Sartre and others, that when after pursuing science for several lifetimes, and we've discovered a lot. But one of the things we've discovered is that there's so much more to discover that we will never know it all. There's this paradox of the infinite again, potentially crushing the spirit of inquiry because it cannot ever solve everything. It puts it,
Yeah.
if the knowledge of nature is inescapably bound up with the human subject, if it's his knowledge, then it is finite, it is limited, not only practically because we are limited and finite, but because knowledge is limited by the fact that his knowing is inescapably a part of it, limited therefore at its very root, which it can never transcend without ceasing to exist altogether. Experimental science, this was the phrase you were pointing to,
Yeah.
Mark, can never transcend its starting point or its own limited instrument, and therefore attain to God's knowledge, for example, from a absolute point where it transcends all anthropomorphisms. We're trapped in our humanity. And Sartre will say, and there's no exit. There is no way out of this. Why don't we then make up since there is no God and there is no good and there is no evil, why don't we make up a few conventions of how we're going to live and be at least existentially real and authentic? But that's about all we can go. And then his next line is, what does theology have to say to this? And Marty, you already gave many things that theology can say if the audience is willing to listen to it. Tom's point here is that science, simply being science, has already come butt up against the absurd.
And willing to listen, though.
Sorry?
The willing to listen phrase that you just used. Mm-hmm. Are they willing to listen? At some level, Torrance is arguing, are you willing to be truly scientific, humble, and open to discover what is there? If you think the world's still flat because it looks flat to you and you've got that written in some book somewhere, and you're unwilling to ask, is it possible the world is round? No one is so blind as those who will not see, right? And I think that the argument that he's trying to set up here, that the nature of human willing, and he even uses the word metanoia, we need to repent of our starting points that limit our ability to know reality as it is, and only live within what we can control.
Yeah.
And in some periods of history, it's politics. In some parts, it's industry and technology. In others, it's who makes the money and how they use things. Money becomes the means of power. But all of these things are vying for that authority to manage and control everything else. And God is inconvenient for all of them.
Well, a God that says no is inconvenient.
A God that says no is inconvenient. Only one that maybe blesses us. That's a good point.
Yes.
Which is merely a Tower of Babel, though, right? You're searching for a God that you can storm the heavens, but God's going to go to work for you in your industry, in the building of your economic success, the building of your political strategies. Now, that is the God who Torrance and Barth and all, in a sense, are seeing beyond merely what is talked about scientifically here. But it begins here in what science gives to us, and that is a place to say what is true about the world and about God, right? There is truth is at stake here. Yeah. And when you limit truth to only what you can manipulate, what have we done? We've made the human God, right?
Yeah.
And the natural world, in a sense, is an extension.
Have you read the whole book yet, Marty?
I read the whole book a decade or so ago. So to say I have it resident in my brain would not be true. If you look at the notes that I have here, they go all the way to the end.
I am very much looking forward to just to put the capstone on this chapter. He is saying science, just by being science, has already come up against its own limitations. It is not limitations that the Inquisition has imposed upon it. It is not limitations that dictatorships have clamped down on it. There are certain built-in fundamental problems with science as a scientia, our way of knowing, and theological science has been dealing with some of these problems for centuries. And so there can be a fruitful way to dialogue. But he's made his point, if the only point he was to make was that science does not have all the answers, and knows that. It's scientifically established that it cannot know all the answers. Therefore, there is more out there for humanity to do than what it can do scientifically. where Tom talks about the priesthood of creation is when he's giving his answer, which is quite compelling.
To be scientific, though, on page 102, where he says, the purer theology is, the more strictly it behaves in terms of the nature of its object, which is revealed as grace. That is why justification by grace alone is not only sets aside natural goodness, but sets aside natural theology, for both belong to the life of the natural man. So he's just saying, to do good science, you have to stick appropriately to the method that allows the nature of the object of your study to inform what it is you come to know. That's what good science has to do all the time.
Yeah.
When we read other agendas in, or human intuitive, this is going to be better for me kind of attitudes, then somebody's going to win, and a lot of people are likely to lose, and it's not really science anymore. It's a kind of technology that selects for the purposes of the technician to create the world that fits their technological needs. And it excludes others who don't fit within that. So on 103, though, I had a question in the bottom paragraph. He talks about the sense of the presence of God, quoting from Bailey's Gifford lecture.
Is.
And I'm trying to I don't know how much you've done with Bailey in that. I haven't known.
Yeah.
He does seem to have the sense that human beings do have the reality of God presses upon us everywhere in nature, not only in the ultimate rationality, which our scientific knowledge of nature must assume, that's divine and contingent order, in order to be what it is, but in a sense of the presence of God, which all men have unless they obstruct or suffocate it, which means they're living in denial kind of here. So what do you make of that? I mean, it does sound like the thing that everybody gets nervous on, but the sense of the presence of God sounds Schleiermachian. It sounds like there's something there. Bart does talk about the lesser lights, that there is the light of Christ. And when you see somebody loving and caring and serving, Bart might say that is the lesser lights that come from the light of Christ. Is there a sense that when we look at the stars, Abraham, look at the stars, someday you will be, your families will be like that, or the sand on the beach, to look at all creation declares the glory of God. Is there a sense in which Torrance and Bailey here are saying we can't get to God through this knowledge, but there is a sense of the presence of God in the world? What do you think?
Because science works, that is to say, when we apprehend order in nature, and we can rely on that. We have discovered something about nature that we can rely on, which then has many more questions. And unfortunately, a lot of natural theologians will use that as their jumping off point. That what you're apprehending is God, and that is more than science can say. But Tom has a couple of his later books. The sentence, I was just looking at it last night, but I don't know if might be The Christian Frame of Mind, where there's a chapter called The Is That Ought to Be. Okay. Not only do we, as we discover what is, something in us chimes in and says, and it is the is that ought to be. And beyond that, he talks about beauty. There are ways in which the human set in creation resonates with creation without needing to be taught to. It's already there. Is that a religious a priori? Technically, no. It is
a little bit like C.S. Lewis's beginning of Mere Christianity. He argues that not everyone agrees what good is, but everyone agrees that there is a good and a not good. And so even that, he said, that's what I heard you kind of pointing towards.
Yeah.
That sense is a kind of a priori of the presence of God somehow in the world.
Yeah, I point out that Bart has always criticized that he never says much about atheism. And Bart replied, it's because the Bible doesn't say much about atheism. Atheism is regarded as foolishness. And Tom here is essentially saying the same thing. A scientific method does not allow you the determined conclusion of atheism. It can only lead to skepticism or agnosticism. All of those would be valid points to stop the inquiry. But not atheism. Atheism is a leap too far. Right. As long as that is true, the church, we as believers have something to say to non-believers, because a part of us can say, you don't really believe that, and you can tell me all sorts of stuff that I don't really believe, but we can have a conversation. We can start talking. For Tom's way of putting it is that over and over and over again, as he contemplates physics and Mozart, there's an is that ought to be, and as long as you can say that, the conversation can continue, and the Bible remains relevant.
Yeah. So on 104, which is the next to the last page, he lays this foundation. I think it's a clarification that scientific theology rejects natural theology as a foundation. But once you acknowledge the nature of the God who creates the world as it is, who allows us to recognize what Torrance calls divine and contingent order, that then what we would call natural sciences have their proper context within what scientific theology does in providing the God who is the source and sustainer, and that much of what science does is actually a science of the gaps. That's like what is accused of religion and Christianity is the godly gaps. Well, you're just bringing in God to answer the questions, and so to say, well, the nature of the purposefulness, the orderliness, you've got really a science of the gaps that would correspond. You're pointing one finger at Christians, you got three fingers pointing back at you, who are also filling in all of your gaps. And so the contention that seems to be here is that there is this history of science and religion and theology that has been there, and that there have been people along the way who have pointed rightly, Bacon being one of them, and maybe at some points even Kant, but that we've really collapsed in our own modern time into something that the human has just decided, or Bart's language of has fallen asleep or has become blind or deaf to the nature of the God who is there, but that the nature of who God is hasn't gone away, and that just to deny reality doesn't make you a better truth teller.
Yeah. I got to go make dinner. Thank you all for your patience. I'm not sure that would have helped. I hope there was
we covered a lot of ground. You are going to be on for the first section of chapter 3 too, which is the nature of scientific activity, in 2 weeks. Next week we will have Paul Molnar on to talk about his new book on the centrality of Christ in the theology of T.F. Torrance. So he's agreed to come on next week.
Wow.
With that book fresh off the press. So we'll ask him questions about what is in this book that hasn't been in your other books. What is the new and the fresh? Give us the good stuff. So anyway, that's what our next week is. And thank you all for this culmination of a really important part of this book. I think every chapter we go through, we're going to go, well, that's the important one.
Yes.
Because there's so much richness in each one, I think that is helpful.
Yeah. But as I kicked this off, I said this is one long sustained argument. Yes. It took him 8 years to write. It threw off 2 additional books that he eventually wrangled into other titles, so that I fully expect we will not be able to say this is what he meant to say until we get to the last page. And then cogitate on it a while, go, now
the thing I'm wondering if we can do is to write a very short, maybe 20-page booklet that just goes through and gives kind of in readable nutshell the salient points that developed as his argument in this book. I think it's possible to do it. And I think we're wrestling through to really hear what those themes are. But I think that there is a discernible golden or scarlet or whatever colored thread would lead us through this and get us out the other side saying, okay, now I can read it again, and I think everything will make more sense. But we'll only get there, as you say, Ken, when we get to the end.
Yeah, and I really, every once in a while, Bart in the Dogmatics will pause and say, well, what have we seen so far? And then he gives about a page and a half of summarizing the previous volume. And then says, and now we enter the circle of, or now we enter the sphere of, and then he goes. I'm waiting for that in here. I think Torrance is a good enough student of Bart that somewhere in here he's going to say, you know what I've been trying to say all along here? This is what I'm trying to say. And we'll probably find out that he probably put it in the preface and we just missed it. But
for my money, for my money, I will go to the last part of reality and scientific theology. I really will. It's very, very interesting.
Right.
Where he talks about subject-object relation, and then he finally goes subject-object-subject, because of the engagement as a human knower and a human worshipper of the triune God in Christ Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that is actually where he finishes, but not in this book. Not in this book.
It's human subject.
Yeah.
Subject, object, subject, because you see the object.
The second one has to have 3 subjects to it, though.
Well, you see the second object is in fact, of course, Jesus and the totus Christus. But that's my riff. That's my riff.
It's like Lewis is with Aslan on the mountain with Shasta. Who are you? Myself, he says 3 times. Myself again. Myself. So anyway,
thank you
blessings
all.
on you all. Happy New Year. We'll see you next week.
Yep, thank you.
See you next week.
Ciao.